we're going to turn right now to the issue of Russia and Ukraine. Secretary of State John Kerry's meeting with Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Geneva to discuss the conflict in Ukraine. The meeting comes just days after Kerry publicly accused Russian officials of lying to his face about their military support for separatist rebels. Russia and Ukraine are also holding direct talks in Brussels to resolve a dispute over delivery of Russian gas. The UN said today the death toll from the nearly year-old conflict has topped 6,000. A recent ceasefire continues to hold over a shaky start. Also in Russia, the murder this weekend on Friday night of the opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, a former deputy prime minister turned dissident politician. Nemtsov was shot dead Friday night near Red Square. He was going to lead a major rally that was critical of Vladimir Putin on Sunday. It grew much larger after his death, with tens of thousands, perhaps 50,000 people marching past the Kremlin carrying signs reading, "I am not afraid." Noam Chomsky, if you can comment on what's happening in Russia and Ukraine.
What's happening is quite ugly, and I think the criticisms are mostly accurate, but they're kind of beside the point. There's a background that we have to think about. It's fashionable now in the United States and Britain to condemn Putin as some sort of distorted mind. There's an article in Psychology Today analyzing his brain, asking why he's so arrogant. He's been accused of having Asperger, irritable, rat-faced man. This is all very reminiscent of the early 1950s. At that time, the U.S. had overwhelming power, and it was able to use the United Nations as a battering ram against its enemy, the Soviet Union. So Russia was, of course, vetoing lots of resolutions condemning it. And the leading anthropologists in the United States and England began to analyze why the Russians are so negative. What makes them say no at the United Nations all the time? And their proposal was that the Russians are negative because they raise their children in swaddling clothes, and that makes them negative. The 3 or 4 of us at Harvard who thought this was ridiculous used to call it diaperology. But the fact is, whatever you think about Putin, okay, irritable, rat-faced man with Asperger's, whatever you like, the Russians have a case, and you have to understand the case. And the case is understood here by people who bother to think. So, for example, there was a lead article in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, by John Mearsheimer with the title like something like "The West is Responsible for the Ukraine Crisis." And he was talking about the background. The background begins with the fall of the Soviet Union, 1989, 1990. There were negotiations between President Bush, James Baker, and Mikhail Gorbachev about how to deal with the issues that arose at the time. A crucial question is what happens to NATO. NATO had been advertised since its beginning as necessary to protect Western Europe from the Russian hordes. Okay, no more Russian hordes, so what happens to NATO? Well, we know what happened to NATO, but the crucial issue was this. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany, a unified Germany, to join NATO, a hostile military alliance. It's a pretty remarkable concession if you think about the history of the preceding century, half-century. It's Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia several times, and now he was agreeing to have Germany join a hostile military alliance led by the only superpower. But there was a quid pro quo that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used in the interchanges, meaning to East Germany. And on that condition, they went forward. NATO immediately moved to East Germany. When Gorbachev vigorously protested, naturally, he was informed by the United States that it was only a verbal commitment. It wasn't on paper. The unstated implication is if you're naive enough to think you can make a gentleman's agreement with us, it's your problem. They didn't say that. I'm saying that. But the NATO moved to East Germany. Under Clinton, moved right up to Russia's borders. Just a couple of weeks ago, U.S. Military equipment was taking part in a military parade in Estonia, a couple hundred yards from the Russian border. Russia is surrounded by U.S. Offensive weapons. Sometimes they're called defense, but they're all offensive weapons. And the idea that the new government in Ukraine that took over after the former government was overthrown, last December, late December, it passed a resolution overwhelmingly, I think something like 308 or something, announcing its intention to take steps to join NATO. For no Russian leader, no matter who it is, could tolerate Ukraine right at the geostrategic center of Russian concerns joining a hostile military alliance. I mean, we can imagine, for example, how the U.S. would have reacted, say, during the Cold War if the Warsaw Pact had extended to Latin America and Mexico and Canada were now planning to join the Warsaw Pact. Of course, that's academic because the first step would have led to a violent U.S. response and wouldn't have gone any further.